In 2004, a group of researchers picked one of the most unusual laboratories imaginable: sugarcane farms in rural India. The farmers there don't get paid monthly. They get paid once a year, right after harvest, which means every single farmer in this study lived two completely different financial lives. Poor before harvest, comfortable after it, without changing jobs, education, or personality. The researchers gave these same farmers a series of basic cognitive tests, simple logic puzzles, attention tests, the kind of thing you'd find on an IQ test. They ran the tests twice, once right before harvest, when the farmers were broke, and once right after, when the exact same farmers had money in hand. Same person, same brain, same intelligence, two different scores. Before harvest, when money was tight, farmers performed significantly worse. The gap was large enough to be the cognitive equivalent of losing an entire night's sleep, or roughly 13 IQ points. After harvest, with money in their pocket, the same farmers solved the same kinds of problems with noticeably sharper focus. Nothing about who they were had changed. Only one thing had changed: how much room they had to breathe. That single finding quietly demolishes one of the most repeated ideas in personal finance content: that rich people simply think better than poor people, that there's a wealth mindset you either have or don't. A switch flips somewhere in childhood that determines whether you'll ever be good with money. If that were true, the sugarcane farmers should have scored the same both times. A mindset doesn't disappear for 6 months and come back, but their scores move with their bank balance, not the other way around. So if it's not mindset, what is it? That question set researchers down a rabbit hole that eventually explains something almost nobody talks about: why smart, disciplined people make embarrassing money to stay at the moment they're under financial pressure, and why some of the wealthiest people on earth, the moment they lose their financial cushion, start behaving exactly like the bad with money stereotype they used to mock. This isn't a video about thinking like the rich. It's an investigation into what actually separates rich decisions from poor ones, and the answer has almost nothing to do with intelligence, discipline, or upbringing. Here's the version of this idea you've probably heard before: rich people think long-term, poor people think short-term. Rich people invest, poor people spend. Rich people take calculated risks, poor people play it safe or gamble recklessly. Say it out loud and it sounds obvious. It's also, according to the research, backwards. Picture a normal Tuesday. Your card gets declined at checkout, not because you're broke, but because you forgot a subscription renewed. In that half second of embarrassment, are you thinking clearly? Probably not. Your brain isn't doing math anymore. It's doing damage control. Now stretch that half second into a permanent condition. That's what financial scarcity actually is. Not poverty as a personality trait, but poverty as a mental operating system stuck permanently in damage control mode. Researchers call this the bandwidth tax. Your brain has a limited amount of mental processing power available at any moment. Attention, working memory, self-control. Under normal conditions, you spend that bandwidth flexibly: work problems, relationships, decisions. Under scarcity, a huge chunk of that bandwidth gets automatically reserved for one obsessive question: will I make it to the end of the month? That reservation isn't optional. It isn't a choice you're making badly. It's involuntary. The same way you can't choose not to feel hungry. And because that bandwidth is gone, it's not available for the good financial decisions we associate with rich thinking. Comparison shopping, reading the fine print, planning 3 moves ahead. This reframes something people love to call laziness or poor discipline. The single mother who takes a payday loan with brutal interest instead of shopping for a cheaper option isn't failing at math. She's making a locally rational decision with a brain that's already spending most of its capacity on next week's rent. The bandwidth tax has already been paid before she even reaches the decision. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for anyone who's ever judged someone else's money choices. Bandwidth tax doesn't check your income first. It checks your margin, which means it can hit a person earning 6 figures with expensive debt just as hard as it hits someone earning minimum wage. So the question isn't why do poor people make worse decisions? It's what happens to anyone's decision making the moment their margin disappears. And the answer to that question shows up in some very rich people's bank accounts too. If bandwidth tax is really about margin and not about class, then it should show up whenever anyone, rich or poor, loses their financial cushion. And And it does, in a pattern that's uncomfortably consistent. Start with lottery winners, one of the most studied groups in behavioral economics. Multiple long-term studies across different countries have tracked what happens after a sudden windfall, and the results keep landing in the same place. A large share of lottery winners end up in financial trouble within a few years, some even worse off than before they won. These weren't people who were bad with money their whole lives. Many held steady jobs, paid bills on time, lived unremarkable financial lives right up until the moment a check for 6 or 7 figures landed in their account. What changed wasn't their intelligence. What changed was that a sudden pile of cash, with no system attached to it, removed the guardrails their old, tighter budget used to force on them. Scarcity had been quietly disciplining their decisions. Remove scarcity without replacing it with structure, and the discipline goes with it. Now flip it the other direction. Professional athletes and high-earning executives who go through sudden income loss, a career-ending injury, a company collapse, a public scandal. Multiple studies on professional athletes have found a significant share face serious financial distress within just a few years of retiring, despite career earnings in the millions. Once their income disappeared, the same bandwidth tax that hits a minimum wage worker started hitting them. Impulsive decisions, avoidance of financial paperwork, decisions optimized for this week instead of this decade. None of these people had a childhood poor mindset installed in them. They had margin, then they didn't, and their decision quality moved with it. In real time, in both directions. This is the part that should genuinely bother anyone who's built a personal brand around mindset as the explanation for wealth. If mindset were a fixed trait, it should survive a financial shock. It doesn't. It behaves more like a weather pattern than a personality, responsive to conditions, not built into character. Which raises an uncomfortable follow-up question. If the rich mindset isn't something people are born with or trained into permanently, then what is actually different about people who stay wealthy decade after decade, through market crashes and personal setbacks? Because some people clearly do build wealth and keep it. That difference is real. It's just not the one you've been told to look for. The people who build wealth and keep it across decades and setbacks share one structural habit that has nothing to do with intelligence or ambition. They protect margin before they chase growth. Margin, in plain terms, is the gap between what you have and what you need. It's the buffer that absorbs a bad month without triggering the bandwidth tax. And it turns out this single variable predicts long-term financial stability better than income, education, or even how disciplined someone appears on the surface. You can see this play out clearly in business. Two companies can launch with identical funding and nearly identical products, and end up on completely different trajectories based on how they treated margin in year one. One well-defined startups. Companies that raise a large amount of capital immediately yields them to match. Bigger offices, bigger teams, aggressive targets, frequently into a festival member slows even slightly, because they discover between the spending and the revenue. When a downturn or a slow quarter hits, there's no slack to absorb it, and decisions start getting made in the same scarcity-driven, short-term panic mode as the sugarcane farmers before harvest. Except now it's happening in boardrooms instead of villages. Compare that to companies that deliberately keep a runway cushion, enough reserve to survive several bad months without changing behavior. These companies aren't necessarily more talented or better resourced. They simply protected the one variable that keeps the brain, or the boardroom, out of tunnel vision mode, margin. This is the actual, unglamorous mechanism behind what looks like rich people think long-term. It's not that wealthy people are innately more patient. It's that margin buys the mental bandwidth required to think long-term in the first place. Remove the margin, and even the most patient person on earth starts making short-term, reactive decisions, because their brain no longer has the spare capacity to do anything else. This also explains a pattern you've probably seen in your own life without naming it. Think about the version of you right after payday. Calm, willing to compare prices, maybe even willing to say no to an impulse purchase. Now think about the version of you 3 days before payday. Tired, more likely to grab the expensive convenience option because you don't have the mental energy to think it through. Same person, same intelligence, different margin, different decisions. That's not a coincidence. That's the bandwidth tax, live in your own week. Here's where this stops being just a psychology story and becomes an economics one. Because scarcity isn't only something that happens to people. In many systems, it's something that gets manufactured, quietly, by the pricing structures poorer people are forced to use. Economists have a term for this, the poverty premium. The well-documented pattern where people with less money end up paying more for the same basic things. No security deposit for a lease, no savings for a large purchase, no credit history for a loan. And the solution the market offers is almost always a more expensive version of the same product. Higher interest rates for those with thin credit files. Rent-own furniture at a steep markup instead of a bulk purchase. Prepaid utility rates that cost more per unit than a standard account requiring good credit. None of these products exist because poor customers are worse at math. They exist because thin margin makes a person a high-risk customer in the eyes of every lender and provider. And high risk always gets priced higher, which means the very condition of having no buffer forces you into paying premiums that make it even harder to build one. It's not a personal failure loop, it's a structural one. This matters because it quietly undermines the entire Just Budget Better school of financial advice aimed at people already living without margin. You can be the most disciplined budgeter alive and still lose ground if every transaction you're forced into carries an invisible scarcity tax on top of the sticker price. The system isn't neutral. It charges interest, literally and figuratively, on not having enough. This is also why margin, once you have any at all, compounds in ways that go beyond investment returns. A small emergency fund doesn't just sit there earning interest. It removes you from the pool of customers who get charged the poverty premium. You stop needing the payday loan. You stop needing the rent-own furniture. You start qualifying for the cheaper version of nearly everything, simply by having enough slack to wait, shop around, or say no. That's the real compounding effect nobody puts in a thumbnail. Not just money making money, but margin making every future dollar go further. Because margin is what buys you access to the cheaper version of the entire economy. Put these threads together and three things emerge that rarely get said out loud in personal finance content. First, the rich mindset is not a cause of wealth. It's a byproduct of margin. The sugarcane farmers prove this in the cleanest possible way. Same brain, same person. Radically different decision quality, purely as a function of how much breathing room they have. Anyone selling mindset as the starting point has the arrow pointing backwards. Margin comes first, the mindset follows. Second, financial discipline is not a fixed trait you either have or lack. It's a resource that gets consumed under pressure and restored under slack. Closer to willpower or physical energy than to a permanent character feature. This is why the same person can be a careful spender one week and an impulsive one the next, without becoming a different person. It also explains why people who grew up with money and later lose it don't automatically retain their old good habits. The habits were never separated from the margin that made them impossible. Third, systems don't just reflect scarcity, they manufacture more of it. The poverty premium means the financial system charges the highest prices to the people who can least afford volatility, which keeps margin out of reach precisely for the people who'd benefit from it most. This means individual effort alone, while necessary, is working against a structural headwind that Just Think Like the Rich advice completely ignores. Connect these three and a different picture of wealth building emerges. It's not a mental upgrade you install through affirmations or biographies of billionaires. It's an engineering problem. Build margin first, protect it aggressively, and let the mental know what that margin frees up do the long-term thinking for you. Because trying to do slow-term thinking without margin is like trying to concentrate or test while genuinely hungry. You can want to focus all you want, the biology won't cooperate. This also reframes what getting rich actually requires from a person. Not superior intelligence, not a personality transplant, not some hidden gene for delayed gratification, just enough structural slack, protected long enough that the brain gets to operate the way it was always capable of operating, and the compounding starts from there. None of this is useful unless it changes what you actually do this month. So here's the practical version. Stripped of theory. Start by treating margin as the first financial goal, ahead of investing, ahead of debt payoff speed, ahead of anything else. Even a small buffer, enough to hurl an adequate event without going into panic mode. Measurably reduces the bandwidth tax because you're in a stop through running the background so if something goes wrong this week. That single change frees up mental capacity for every other decision you make, which is why financial experts consistently rank a small emergency fund as more urgent than aggressive investing, even though it earns far less return. The return isn't financial, it's cognitive. Second, notice when you're making decisions in scarcity mode, and delay big decisions out of that window whenever possible. The days right before payday, right after an unimpacted bill, right after a stressful conversation about money. These are statistically worth moments to sign a loan, make a big purchase, or lock in a long-term financial commitment. Because your available bandwidth is at its lowest. If a decision can wait 48 hours until margin returns, let it wait. Third, actively route yourself out of poverty premium products the moment you have any margin at all, even a little. Refinancing a high-interest debt, switching from a prepaid to a standard account, buying the bulk size instead of the expensive convenience size. These aren't glamorous moves, but each one removes you from a system charging you extra for not having enough, and each one frees up margin for the next move. Fourth, if you're building something bigger, a business, a career pivot, any long-term project, resist the instinct to spend a windfall down to zero the moment it arrives. The sugarcane farmers, the lottery winners, and the startups that scaled spending too fast all failed the same test. They treated a temporary cash infusion as a new permanent baseline. Protect a portion of any windfall as untouchable margin before you let the rest fund ambition. None of these four moves require a personality change. They require treating margin as infrastructure, something you build and defend, the same way you'd protect a foundation before adding floors to a building. Go back to those sugarcane farmers for a second. Before harvest, broke and mentally taxed, they weren't lacking intelligence. They were lacking room. After harvest, with money in hand, nothing about who they were had changed. Only how much space their brain had to work with. That's the entire story compressed into one field study. Not a mindset switch, not a discipline gene, just margin. Present or absent, quietly determining how well a perfectly capable mind gets to function. So the next time you see advice telling you to think like the rich as if it's a personality you can borrow, remember what actually happened in that experiment. In those lottery winners' bank accounts, in those startups that burned through funding, and in the poverty premium charged to anyone without a buffer. The mindset was never the starting point. It was always the result. Which means the real question isn't how do I think like a rich person, it's how do I build even a small amount of margin, protect it, and let my own mind do what it was always capable of doing once the pressure comes off. You don't need to become someone else to make better financial decisions. You need room to think like the person you already are.